There are women who are sold without ever knowing their worth. Elena Hartwell is one of them, 24 years old, living like a shadow in a city no one remembers. Until one night a strange man sat in the secluded corner of the rundown diner where she worked and looked at her in a way no one had ever seen before. Not with lust, not with pity, with calculation. That night Elena discovered the truth. Her father had signed her name as if signing a receipt, and the debt collector was on his way. If you are reading this story, please like and comment the name of the city you are in so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't turn off the screen, because the best part is yet to come. The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time the dinner rush hit the Starlight Diner, it had turned the streets outside into something closer to a river than a road. Elena Hartwell moved between the tables the way water moves around stone, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned over years of hard and specific lessons that the less space she took up, the less likely anyone was to notice her at all. She was 24, but she moved like someone older, like someone who had packed 10 years of exhaustion into a body that had only been alive for 24 of them. The Starlight sat on the cracked western edge of Kelmore, a city that existed mostly in the imagination of people who had never left it, and in the regret of those who had. The diner was the kind of place where the neon in the window had been half broken for so long that regulars used the flicker as a landmark. Turn left at the sign that can't decide what it wants to say. The booths were red vinyl, gone the color of old wounds. The floor tiles had a pattern once. No one remembered what it was. Elena worked the closing shift 4 nights a week and the double on Saturdays. She took whatever extra hours Marcy, the owner, would give her, and she never complained about the tips, which were bad, or the customers, who were worse. She kept a folded 20 in her apron pocket at all times. Not spending money, but emergency money, which was a different animal entirely. The difference between the two was a lesson her mother had tried to teach her before her mother stopped being around to teach anything. Tonight the diner had the usual assortment, a trucker at the counter who kept calling her sweetheart and meant it with no particular menace. 2 women from the factory 2 blocks over who ordered coffee and split a slice of pie and talked in low voices about someone at work who had said something unforgivable. A young couple in the second booth who were clearly in the middle of a fight they were trying to have quietly in a public place because neither of them had anywhere private to go. Elena moved through all of it the way she always did. Efficient, invisible, present only enough to do the job. She was refilling the trucker's coffee when the bell above the door rang, and she felt something shift in the room without being able to name it immediately. He came in out of the rain without hurrying, which was the first thing she noticed. Most people pushed through weather, hunched against it, shook it off once inside. This man walked through it like it had nothing to do with him. He wore a charcoal overcoat, water darkened at the shoulders, and he stood just inside the entrance for a moment and looked at the room the way you look at a room you're about to work in. Not browsing, assessing. He was somewhere in his 40s, not large in any obvious way, but built with a kind of density that made him seem more substantial than his actual frame suggested. His face was the kind of face that gave nothing away easily. Not cold exactly, but controlled, the way certain machines are controlled, every moving part doing only what it was built to do. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow that he'd stopped noticing years ago. His eyes were the color of deep water. He took the corner booth without being seated. That booth was technically reserved for large parties. A sign on the wall said so, but no one said anything. Elena noticed that too. The trucker at the counter had gone quiet. The factory women had lowered their voices further. Even the arguing couple in booth 2 had reached some unspoken pause. Elena picked up a menu she knew he didn't need and carried it to the corner. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes." He didn't look at the menu. He looked at her. Not in the way the trucker looked at her, not searching for anything she was supposed to provide. In the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand the structure of. "You want to order food or just the coffee?" "Just the coffee for now." She poured it and left and did not look back at the corner booth. But she felt it the rest of the shift the way you feel a low-pressure system coming. Not the storm itself, but the change in the air before it. His name was not on the reservation list because there was no reservation list. His name was not on anything in this city that could be found easily. Vincent Moretti had been careful about that for most of his adult life, and careful had kept him alive and free, and operating when others like him had disappeared into systems that ate men and left no record. He had come to the Starlight Diner because of a name, Elena Hartwell. And he had come tonight specifically because of a conversation 3 days prior with a man named Ruiz, who was the kind of person who existed at the junction of information and money, and who had told him something that required personal verification before he decided what to do about it. He was not in the habit of making decisions without personal verification. He drank the coffee slowly. It was bad coffee. He did not mind bad coffee. He watched Elena Hartwell move through the diner, and he cataloged what he saw the way he always cataloged everything. Not because he wanted to, but because his mind did not have a setting that stopped doing it. She kept her left shoulder slightly lower than her right. She favored her right side when she turned away from customers, creating a smaller profile. Her eye contact was brief and systematic, enough to appear engaged, not enough to invite extension. She smiled on a half-second delay when she smiled at all, like someone who had learned to perform the expression rather than produce it naturally. He saw the faint discoloration along her jaw that foundation had almost covered. He saw the way her fingers went still when the door opened and then moved again once she'd processed whoever had entered. He saw the folded bill in her apron pocket and recognized it for what it was. He was still sitting there when the restaurant began to empty toward 9 o'clock. The trucker left. The factory women left. The arguing couple had apparently achieved some temporary truce and left together without resolving anything. Elena cleared their booth and carried the dishes back, and the diner got quiet in the specific way diners get quiet near closing. Not peaceful exactly, just depleted. At 9:14, a man came in. Elena heard him before she saw him. The sound of the door was different, harder, faster, the bell catching with a clatter instead of a ring. She turned from the counter, and her body did the thing it did without her permission, that half-second freeze that happened whenever something in the environment shifted wrong. He was mid-30s, wide through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket with the collar turned up even though he was inside now. He had the look of someone who had been drinking since the afternoon, not falling down drunk, but the meaner kind, the kind where the body was still coordinated but the judgment was gone, and something that usually stayed leashed had gotten loose. His name was Doyle. He was a regular in the loose sense of the word. He came in 3 or 4 times a month, always late, always in some state of chemical recalibration, always with a way of looking at Elena that she had learned to respond to by becoming functionally transparent. Don't react. Don't escalate. Take the order. Keep the distance. Wait for closing. Tonight he came in with a different energy. Hey, he pointed at her across the empty diner, not asking for anything yet, just announcing his presence. Hey, Elena. Evening, she said. She was already reaching for the coffee pot, the automatic move, the thing to do with her hands. Don't bother with that. He moved toward the counter and didn't sit, just stood at the edge of it, too close to the space that was supposed to be hers. I'm not here for coffee. The kitchen closes at 9:30. I said I'm not here for food. She set the coffee pot down and kept her voice flat and procedural. Then I'm going to have to ask you to... He moved fast for someone in his condition. His hand came across the counter and closed around her wrist before she'd finished the sentence, and the pain was immediate and specific. Not breaking anything, but gripping with that particular force that announces its own capability to do worse. I want to talk, he said. That's all. I just want to talk. She did not pull against it. She'd learned that pulling was invitation. She kept her body still and her face neutral, and she did the calculation she always did. How long until Marcy came out from the back? What was between her and the exit, whether screaming would help or not? The voice came from the corner booth. Let go of her. 3 words. Not loud. Not urgent. Not the voice of someone who was afraid of what happened if they weren't obeyed. The voice of someone who had already run the scenario and was simply announcing the conclusion. Doyle turned. Elena felt his grip loosen by instinct, not by choice, his body responding to something his brain was still catching up to. Vincent Moretti was standing now. He hadn't moved far from the booth, but he didn't need to. He stood with his hands at his sides and his weight distributed with the stillness of someone who had no need to perform threat because threat was simply a property of his presence. This isn't your business, Doyle said. The words came out, but they came out with less conviction than he'd intended. It is now. Vincent's eyes moved once to Elena, a question without words. Are you hurt? and then back to Doyle. Last time. Doyle let go of her wrist. He did it like he'd decided to, like he was choosing magnanimity rather than responding to the pressure of something he couldn't quite name. He said something under his breath that Elena didn't catch, and then he turned and went back out into the rain, and the door hit the frame harder than it needed to. Elena stood at the counter with her wrist against her chest, not because it was badly hurt, because she needed to hold on to something. Marcy came out from the back 30 seconds later and looked at the empty diner and at Elena and said, "Everything okay?" "Fine," Elena said. Marcy looked at the corner booth and at the man in the charcoal overcoat who had sat back down with his coffee and appeared to be finding nothing unusual about any of this. She looked at Elena again. Elena nodded. Marcy went back to the kitchen. Elena stood for a moment, and then she carried the coffee pot to the corner booth, because she needed something to do, and because not going to the corner booth seemed somehow worse than going. She refilled his cup, even though it didn't need refilling. "Thank you," she said. The words were formal and a little stiff. "You don't need to say that." "I know I don't need to. I'm saying it." He looked at her for a moment. "How often does that happen?" "That's not your business." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She stood there a beat longer than she meant to. There was something about the way he'd said that, the agreement, that disarmed her more than she expected. She was used to men who pushed back when you drew a line. This one had simply acknowledged where the line was. "I haven't seen you before," she said. "No." "You from Kelmore?" "No." "What are you here for?" He looked at his coffee. "I'll explain that when you close up." She looked at him. "I don't think so." "I understand." He reached into his coat and set something on the table. Not a weapon, not money, just a small card with a phone number handwritten on it. "If you change your mind—" She didn't touch the card. She went back to the counter and finished her side work and did not look at the corner booth again, even though she was aware of him the entire time with a precision that was almost physical. At 9:58, she turned the sign to closed and started on the floor, and when she looked up, he was still there. "I said no," she said. "You said you didn't think so." He stood slowly, put on his coat. "There's a difference." She gripped the mop handle. "Mr. Moretti. Mr. Moretti, I don't know who you are, and I appreciate what you did tonight, but I have a policy about strange men in empty diners." "That's a reasonable policy." "Then why are you still here?" He buttoned the middle button of his overcoat and looked at her directly, and she felt it again. That thing in his gaze that was not attraction or aggression, but something else. Something that felt disturbingly like the attention of someone who already knew something about you that you hadn't said. "Because I know about the black serpents," he said. The mop handle was suddenly something she was holding very carefully. "And I know about Carver Wolf," he continued. "And I know about your brother Kyle." The room that had been empty and ordinary a second ago was now a different room. The same floor, the same broken neon throwing a sickly light through the wet window. The same smell of old fryer oil and industrial cleaner, but different. "What about Kyle?" she said. The question didn't come out right. It came out like she already didn't want to know the answer. "He came to us 6 weeks ago," Vincent said, "with a proposal." Silence. The rain hit the window in uneven bursts. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator compressor cycled. "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that involves you." Elena set the mop against the wall and crossed her arms and did not move. She stood in the center of the diner with the closed sign at her back and the rain at the windows and looked at this man who had walked out of nowhere and sat in her corner booth and said her brother's name with the flat effect of someone reading a line from a document. "Explain," she said. He did. It took 12 minutes. He spoke without embellishment, without cruelty, without any discernible emotion, which was somehow the most devastating thing about it. The facts arrived in sequence like they'd been organized in advance, because they had been. Kyle Hartwell had approached a contact associated with Vincent's organization approximately 6 weeks prior. He had brought with him a file, not a literal file, but a body of information. Elena's schedule, her address, her financial situation, her relationship to their father Danny Hartwell's debt. Danny Hartwell owed money to the Black Serpents, the most active criminal organization operating in Kelmore's industrial sector. The debt was 6 figures and had been accumulating for 3 years. Carver Wolf, who ran the Serpents, had given Danny extensions out of a combination of patience and calculation because Danny had something to offer, a daughter in a precarious enough position that she could be leveraged. Elena had never known about this. She had understood her father's gambling as a problem, not as a structure she was living inside of. She had not known that she was the collateral. Kyle had gone to Vincent's people not to rescue her, but to sell her first. He had come with an offer, Elena as a controlled asset in exchange for the Serpent's debt being transferred to a different creditor, one who would not make the same demands. Kyle would remain clean. Danny would get partial relief. Elena would become someone else's problem, managed more carefully, extracted more profitably. Vincent had declined. He had declined for reasons he did not fully explain, but the shape of which Elena could intuit from the way he'd described it. Not moral revulsion exactly, or not only that, but something more strategic. He had declined, and then he had watched, because the proposal told him something about what was happening in Kelmore that he needed to know. And now he was here. Elena stood very still through all of this. She had learned in her life that when the world was restructuring itself around you, the best thing to do was not move until you understood the new shape. So she stood, and she listened, and she did not speak until he had finished. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you should know what you're inside of." "Why do you care what I know?" He looked at her for a moment, and something moved in his face that was too complex to name quickly. "That's a better question," he said. "I don't have a clean answer to it." "Try?" "You're in a situation that is going to accelerate," he said. "Wolf has been patient with your father because patience cost him nothing. That's changing. He has a timeline now. Within the next few weeks. Why do you know this?" "Because knowing things is what I do." "Who are you?" He looked at her without expression. "Someone who operates in the space between what's legal and what's necessary. I run money, logistics, and information for people who can't use formal systems. I've been doing it for 20 years. I am very good at it." "That's not an answer." "It is. Just not a comfortable one." She looked at him. She looked at the card on the table that she hadn't touched. The rain had slackened slightly outside, not stopping but losing its urgency. She thought about Kyle. She thought about the way Kyle had looked at her 3 Sundays ago at their father's kitchen table, eating eggs, talking about nothing, and she understood now what had been behind his eyes that morning. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something she had not had a word for then, but had a word for now. "Get out," she said. He moved toward the door without protest. "The card is on the table," he said when he reached the door. "If you need it." "I won't." He left. Elena stood in the empty diner for a long time after the door closed. She stood until she was sure she was alone, and then she sat down in the corner booth, his booth, and put her hands flat on the table and stared at them. Her wrist still had the ghost of Doyle's grip on it, a warmth that hadn't become a bruise yet but would. She thought about 6 years of working this diner, 6 years of the invisible life, 6 years of being careful and small and below the threshold of notice. And all that time, her father's name on a contract she didn't know existed. Her brother's handshake in a room she'd never been allowed to enter. She picked up the card. She didn't call. Not that night. But she put the card in her apron pocket next to the folded 20, and she went back to mopping the floor, and she did not sleep well, and in the morning, when she woke up, she lay in her narrow bed in her narrow apartment and listened to the city do what cities do and thought about what it meant that she had never known she was being priced. 3 days passed. She moved through them carefully. She called Kyle twice, and he answered once, and she asked him nothing directly because she didn't yet know how to ask what she needed to ask without showing that she knew. He sounded normal. He sounded like her brother, the one she'd grown up with, the one who had covered for her once when she was 16 and their father came home wrong. She held that memory in one hand and what Vincent had told her in the other, and she could not make them weigh the same. On the third evening, she served a couple in the second booth who didn't speak to each other once during the meal, who paid the check and left a poor tip and went out into whatever life they'd constructed that required that much silence. And Elena stood at the counter after they'd gone and took the card out of her apron pocket and looked at it. She called the number. It rang once. "I'm listening," Vincent said. You said Wolf has a timeline, she said. What does that mean? It means he stopped being patient. Your father missed a payment 2 days ago. Not the first, but this one he made no arrangement around. Wolf's people made contact this morning. The fluorescent light above the counter buzzed in the way it had buzzed for as long as she could remember, that small electric insistence she'd stopped noticing, and now it seemed very loud. How do you know that? She said. I have people close to the Serpent's operations. Why? Because I've been building a reason to take Wolf's network apart for 14 months, he said. Your situation has become adjacent to that reason. She sat down on the stool behind the counter. Through the window, the street was dark and wet, and a bus went past throwing water. What happens if I do nothing? She said. Someone comes to your door. In the next week, probably less. Not for a conversation. She breathed. And if I talk to you? Then you know what's coming, and knowing gives you options. What kind of options? The kind you don't have right now. She was quiet for a long moment. Where? She said. He named a coffee shop on the east side, the kind of place that was open late and had enough traffic that two people sitting across from each other looked like nothing. 11 o'clock tonight. She closed the diner at 10:30 and walked the 12 blocks in the rain with her collar up and her mind running the quiet, specific fear that had been her companion since childhood. Not the screaming kind, not the kind that paralyzed, but the low-grade current of alertness that never fully shut off. The kind that had kept her functional and moving and alive through things she hadn't shared with anyone. He was already there when she arrived. Corner table, coffee in front of him. No briefcase, no files, nothing to suggest this was a formal thing, which she supposed was the point. She sat down and ordered tea she didn't want and looked at him. Tell me about my brother, she said. He told her, more this time. The full conversation Kyle had with his contact. The language Kyle had used. Clinical, transactional, the language of someone who had thought about this enough that it had become ordinary to him. Elena listened and did not look away, and felt something change in the way she understood the last 6 years of her life. Not every memory. She was not ready to do that yet, but the shape of the structure around them, the invisible walls. Did you think I was like that? She said. When you came to the diner. I didn't know what you were, he said. That was the first time I'd seen you. But you had a file. I had information. It's not the same thing as knowing a person. Is it the same thing as pricing one? He looked at her directly. No, I didn't price you. I assessed a situation. What's the difference? The difference is that situations can be changed, he said. Prices are fixed. She looked at him for a long time after that. Outside the coffee shop, the rain had stopped somewhere during that last exchange, and the street was doing what wet streets do when the rain stops, shining with everything it had caught and held. Elena looked at her tea, and then at her hands, and then at the man across from her who had walked into her life 3 days ago and rearranged it without asking permission. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing yet. But eventually. Possibly. That's not an answer. No? He agreed. It isn't. She looked at the street. A car went past, headlights cutting the slick pavement. She thought about the 20 in her apron pocket, the emergency money, the lesson from a woman who was gone now. She thought about her father's signature on something she had never been shown. If I stay in my apartment, she said, if I just go home tonight and stay there. Someone will come in the next few days, probably from the Serpents, to talk, at first. The talking will be brief. She nodded slowly. She had known this, she realized. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. She had known for a long time that the life she was living was not as invisible as she'd made it. She had just not known the reason. Okay, she said. He waited. Okay, she said again. I want to know everything. He looked at her across the table, and she couldn't read what moved in his face, whether it was relief or calculation or something genuinely human that he hadn't decided yet what to do with. Maybe all three. Maybe in the kind of life he led, those things had long since stopped being separate. Then I'll tell you everything, he said. He reached for his coffee, and she reached for her tea. And outside the night was the kind of quiet that only comes after rain, the city holding its breath, everything poised on a ledge between what it had been and what it was going to be. And neither of them could have said yet which way it would fall, only that the falling had already begun, and there was no version of this that ended with her back behind the counter of the Starlight Diner, as if none of this had happened. The question was not whether her life was going to change. The question was whether she was going to be the one who changed it, or whether she was going to arrive at the change like she had always arrived at everything. Too late, on someone else's schedule, already priced and packaged and moving on a track she'd never been shown. She drank her tea. Vincent Moretti watched her across the table with the eyes of a man who was very good at waiting, and something in his expression suggested that he was waiting for something specific. Not information, not cooperation, not the thing that people in his world usually extracted from people in hers. Something else, something he perhaps hadn't planned on needing. She set the cup down. "Start from the beginning," she said, and he did. But 3 blocks away, at that exact moment, in a car parked outside Elena Hartwell's apartment building, a man named Briggs was sending a text message to Carver Wolf. 3 words: "She's not home." And Wolf's response came back in under a minute. Then wait. Briggs had been sitting in the car for 2 hours when his phone buzzed again. "Wolf. Location?" Briggs typed back. "Still out. Checked the diner. Closed up. No sign. 3 minutes of nothing. Then, stay there." Briggs settled into the seat and turned the heat up and watched the entrance to Elena Hartwell's building the way he watched most things, without any particular feeling about it. He was not a man who brought feelings to work. He had found early in his career that feelings were a kind of ballast that slowed everything down, and the men who moved fastest in Wolf's organization were the ones who had quietly jettisoned most of what made them complicated. He did not know that 2 miles east, in a coffee shop with fogged windows, the woman he was waiting for was learning the precise dimensions of the cage she'd been living in. Elena sat with her hands around the tea she hadn't finished and listened to Vincent lay it out in full. The Black Serpents had been operating in Kelmore for 11 years. What had started as a numbers operation had metastasized into something more diversified and therefore more dangerous: loan sharking, cargo theft, a trafficking network that moved people through the city's industrial port under cover of legitimate freight. Carver Wolf was not a theatrical criminal. He was an administrator. He ran his organization the way a plant manager runs a factory: quotas, accountability, a clear chain of consequence for missed targets. Danny Hartwell had been in Wolf's system for 3 years. The original debt was $40,000, borrowed against the possibility of a streak that never came. Interest had compounded it to 60, then 80, then into territory that no run of luck at any table was going to solve. Wolf had extended the repayment window twice, which was unusual enough that it required explanation. The explanation was Elena. "He knew about her?" Elena said. "He knew about the household," Vincent said. "Your father talked. Not intentionally, probably. People in debt talk because talking feels like movement when nothing else is moving. Wolf's people listened. What they heard was, single daughter, no partner, financially precarious, socially isolated." He paused. "An ideal leverage point." Elena looked at the table. "How long has he known?" 18 months. Maybe longer. 18 months. She ran the calendar backward in her head. 18 months ago, she'd been fighting with the landlord about a heating unit that didn't work. She'd been picking up extra shifts at the diner. She'd been calling her father every Sunday and listening to him sound like a man who was almost okay, almost managing, almost on top of it. She had believed that. She had needed to believe it. And so she had. "My father knows I'm—" She stopped. "Does he know what Wolf plans to do with me?" Vincent was quiet for a moment. "He knows you're the reason he's still got both his hands," he said. The coffee shop noise continued around them. The machine behind the counter, 2 men at a table near the window talking about something to do with a truck route, a woman typing on a laptop with the focused aggression of someone on a deadline. All of it completely normal. Elena sat in the middle of it and felt the floor doing something strange beneath her. "He knew," she said. "I don't know how much he understood about what it meant. People in debt tell themselves, 'Don't.'" Her voice came out flat and hard. "Don't explain him to me." Vincent closed his mouth and nodded once. She sat with it for a moment. She had a skill for sitting with things. She'd developed it young, in a house where the furniture of family had been rearranged constantly by forces she couldn't control, and the only reliable response was to stay still until the new shape became clear. She used that skill now. She breathed. She let the information settle into her without fighting the weight of it. "What does Kyle get out of it?" she said. "If he sells me to your people instead of Wolf?" "The debt transfers. Your father owes the money to a different creditor, one who operates differently than Wolf. No physical leverage. Structured repayment. Kyle keeps his hands clean and positions himself as the man who solved the family problem. By selling his sister. By transferring the asset," Vincent said, and the way he said it, not cruelly but with the flat precision of someone quoting the language that had actually been used, hit her somewhere specific. "Asset," she said. "His word." She pushed the tea away. "Why did you say no?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I don't run that kind of operation." "That's not a full answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He turned his coffee cup in his hands once, a small motion, the closest thing to restlessness she'd seen from him. "Because you weren't part of any equation I'd agreed to be part of. Kyle came with an offer. The offer was a person. I don't purchase people. But you evaluated me anyway. I evaluated the situation. You evaluated me. You sat in my diner for 4 hours and you watched me and you—" She stopped herself. The anger was useful, but not right now. She could feel it the way you feel a storm through a wall. Present, real, coming, not yet. "You decided I was worth watching." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a beat. "Because no one in that situation had thought to ask what you wanted. And that seemed like important missing information." She stared at him. "That's a very careful way of saying something." "I know." "What are you actually saying?" He met her eyes. "I don't know yet," he said. "And I am not in the habit of saying things I haven't determined the truth of." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away out the window, at the wet street reflecting the lights of nothing in particular. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. The other kind. The kind that accumulated in the bones over years of managing fear and pretending it was just ordinary alertness. "What do you need from me to take Wolf down?" she said. "I need Wolf to move on you." The sentence landed in the air between them. "You need him to come after me. I need him to activate his network around you. When he does, I can map it. The trafficking routes, the money channels, the people he uses to move assets through the port. He's been careful for 11 years. The only time he gets careless is when he thinks he's already won. And I'm the bait. You would be informed and protected at every step." "That's not the same as not being bait." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him. She wanted to be angry at him for this, but she found when she actually tested the feeling that the anger didn't quite land where she aimed it. He was not lying to her. He was not pretending the arrangement was something other than what it was. There was a strange integrity to that, or something that felt like integrity, that she distrusted herself for noticing. "I need to think," she said. "That's reasonable. I need to go home. I'll have someone outside your building tonight. I don't want—" "Well, it's not a favor," he said. "Briggs has been parked outside for 2 hours." She went very still. "What?" "One of Wolf's men. He's been sitting in a gray Civic on the north side of your building since 10 o'clock. The coffee shop, the machine, the 2 men talking about truck routes, the woman typing, everything exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago and somehow entirely different. "You knew this," she said. "I found out 20 minutes into our conversation. I didn't want to tell you before you'd heard everything. That was my choice to make. You're right. I made it for you. I'm telling you now." She breathed. The anger found its target this time. "Don't do that again." "Okay. I mean it. I know you do." She stood up and put on her coat, and the way she did it, deliberate, unhurried, not letting the information in her body show on the surface, was something she'd learned young and practiced long, and which Vincent watched without comment, though she felt him watching. "How do I get home without him seeing me?" she said. "Go out the back, left on Calder Street, then 2 blocks south. There's a car waiting. My man will take you to a hotel for tonight. No, not your apartment. I have work tomorrow. I'll handle that. You won't handle anything for me without asking first. He looked at her. You're right. I'm sorry. Will you allow me to arrange a car and a hotel for tonight while we determine whether it's safe for you to return to your apartment? The formal phrasing, the precise correction, she couldn't tell if it was genuine or if it was what happened when someone who operated in his world tried to do the thing they understood as respecting a person. Maybe there was no difference. Maybe that was all respect was at a certain level of damage, just doing the adjusted version of the thing you would otherwise do without asking. Yes, she said. Fine. She did not sleep well in the hotel. It was a clean room on the east side of the city, nothing remarkable about it, the kind of room that existed specifically to be stayed in temporarily by people in transition. She lay on top of the covers in her work clothes because undressing felt like more commitment to the situation than she wanted to make, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about her father. She thought about the Sunday meals, the way Danny Hartwell talked about his gambling, the way other men talked about a bad back, something chronic, something managed, something that was just part of the landscape of him now and didn't need to be dwelt on. She had accepted that framing. She had been accepting it for years because the alternative, that the gambling was not a symptom but a structure, and that the structure had been loading weight onto her without her consent, was a thought she had kept at the edge of her mind and refused to walk all the way into. She walked into it now. In the hotel room at 12:43 in the morning, she walked all the way in. Her father had let this happen, not in a moment of weakness, in a sustained, ongoing, years-long process of allowing. He had accepted Wolf's extensions. He had sat across from her at Sunday tables and eaten eggs and let her believe the debt was manageable, let her believe the Sunday calls were just maintenance of a normal family relationship, let her believe she was choosing to visit rather than being kept adjacent to an accounting system that listed her as an asset. Kyle had done worse. Kyle had taken the structure their father had passively maintained and had tried to monetize it directly. Kyle had looked at his sister and seen a transaction. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw nothing but the insides of her own eyelids. At 7 in the morning, Vincent called. Briggs left at 3, he said. He'll be back. I know. How are you? She paused. It was a strange question coming from him. It felt slightly too human for what she understood of him, which made her suspicious of it, which made her suspicious of her own suspicion. I want to talk to my father, she said. I'd advise against it right now. I didn't ask for advice. A beat. Okay. Can I ask what you'd say to him? I don't know yet. Elena. The first time he'd used her name, it landed with more weight than she expected. If you confront your father now, it moves the timeline in ways that are hard to control. Wolf's people are watching the family. Any significant change in communication patterns between you and your father in the next 48 hours will register. She knew he was right. She hated knowing he was right. 48 hours, she said. Maybe less. She stared at the hotel ceiling. And Kyle. Silence. Kyle is more complicated, he said. Explain complicated. Another pause, a longer one. Kyle has been in contact with Wolf's people in the last 18 hours. We don't know what about yet. The air in the hotel room shifted. He's talking to Wolf directly now, she said. It appears so. Why? Possibly because my people declined his offer and he moved to the original buyer. Possibly because Wolf approached him. We're working on that. Elena sat up on the edge of the bed. She pressed her feet flat against the floor. The carpet was the generic beige of a room designed for people who weren't going to be there long. She pressed her feet flat and felt the solid, specific reality of the floor and used it the way she always used it, as evidence that she was still here, still upright, still making decisions rather than having them made around her. I want to see Kyle, she said. Elena, not to confront him. I want to see him. I want to look at him and know what I'm working with. That's, He stopped. She heard him recalibrate. I can arrange that. Neutrally. A setting where it wouldn't be unusual for the two of you to interact. He calls me every Thursday. I haven't picked up in 2 weeks. If I call him today, he'll think nothing of it. A pause. What would you say? I'd invite him to dinner. Dad's birthday is next week. I'd say we should plan something. She heard herself saying it and felt the coldness of how easy it was, how quickly the performance came to her, how practiced she was at being what people expected her to be. The invisible daughter, the accommodating sister. She had worn those shapes so long they fit without effort. He'll say yes. He always says yes to something that makes him look like a good son. Okay, Vincent said. Okay, set it up. I'll have someone in the restaurant. I don't want a babysitter. Not a babysitter. Someone who can read the room. She didn't like it. She said yes anyway because she understood the difference between what she liked and what the situation required, and she had always been better at that difference than most people. She called Kyle at 8:15. He picked up on the second ring. Hey. His voice was its ordinary voice, the same voice she'd been listening to for 24 years. She tested it now against what she knew, the way you test ice with one foot before committing your weight, and found she could not hear anything definitive in it. That was almost worse. Hey, she said. Dad's birthday. Right, yeah. The sound of movement on his end. He was in a car, she thought. I was going to call you about that. Dinner? We could do that place on Mercer he likes. Sure, yeah, that works. He paused. You okay? You sound... I'm tired. Long week. Yeah. Another pause, the sound of a turn signal somewhere in his background. Dinner's good. Thursday? Thursday, she said. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she got up and showered and put on the same clothes and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long time, without thinking anything in particular, just looking, the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet but are committed to solving. Thursday came, and it came wrong. Kyle was already at the table when she arrived. He stood when he saw her, the reflex of someone who had learned manners as performance rather than instinct, and he hugged her with the practiced warmth of a man who understood the optics of brotherly affection. She let herself be hugged. She felt his back under her arms and thought about asset and price and transfer and kept her face in the shape it needed to be in. They ordered. He talked about work, something to do with a logistics contract that was almost signed. She listened and asked the small confirming questions that indicated listening. The restaurant was not crowded on a Thursday at 7. She was aware of the man 2 tables over who was reading something on his phone and was probably not reading something on his phone. How's the diner? Kyle said. Same. You should think about something else. You've been there, what, 5 years? 6. 6 years, Elena. You could do more than that. She looked at him. Her brother. 31 years old, good-looking in the way of someone who had always been told so, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes and a particular quality of attention that she was reading differently now than she ever had before. He was watching her the way you watch something you have a stake in. I'm fine, she said. I'm not saying you're not. I'm just saying, Kyle. She set her fork down. Not dramatically, just placed it on the plate. How's Dad? A flicker, just one, behind his eyes. He's okay. You know how he is. Same. He said something to me last week, she said, about money. The flicker again, more pronounced now, a ripple across the controlled surface of him. What did he say? He said he was close to getting on top of it. She watched him. What do you think he meant by that? Kyle picked up his drink. Dad always says he's close to something. Does he? Elena. He set the drink down. What's this about? I'm just asking about Dad. No, you're not. He looked at her and she saw it. Not guilt, which would have been almost a relief, but something more complicated. Something that involved a calculation happening in real time. You're asking me something with the thing about Dad wrapped around it. You've always done that. Just say what you want to say. She looked at her brother. 24 years of history, the time he'd covered for her, the time she'd called him at midnight when the heating broke and he'd driven across town with a space heater and said nothing that needed to be said. All of that was real. All of that had happened. And it was also true that 3 weeks ago he had sat across from men she didn't know and described her in language that did not include the word sister. I know about the approach you made, she said. The restaurant continued around them. Silverware. Voices at other tables. Kyle Hartwell's face went through 3 expressions in 4 seconds: surprise, recalculation, and then something that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but occupied the territory between them. Elena, don't. Her voice was quiet and even, and she kept it that way with a deliberate effort that he probably couldn't see. Just tell me what you told yourself to make it okay. He leaned forward. When he spoke, his voice was low and tight, and the performance was gone. I was trying to solve a problem. Dad was running out of time. Wolf was going to... By selling me. By selling me, Kyle. She said it without raising her voice, without looking away. Say the word. His jaw worked. He looked down at his plate. You never told me, she said. You sat across from Dad and you sat across from me and you made a decision about my life and you never told me. I was going to tell you. When? When I'd sorted it out, when there was a plan. You made me into a plan. He was quiet. When he looked up, his eyes had something in them she hadn't seen before. Something ragged. Something that might have been shame if it hadn't been threaded through with the particular self-justifying logic of a man who had convinced himself his reasoning was sound. Wolf would have come for you anyway, he said. I was trying to... Don't tell me what you were trying to do. She picked up her fork again. She took a bite of food she couldn't taste. The man 2 tables over had not looked up from his phone. Dad signed something, she said. Didn't he? An actual agreement. Kyle said nothing. Kyle. 6 days ago, he said quietly. Wolf's people brought a document. Dad signed it. She chewed and swallowed and breathed. What does it say? She said. Kyle looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of genuine sorrow if it had been allowed to develop. Elena? Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down. Vincent's number. She let it buzz. What does it say? She repeated. It formalizes you as collateral, against the debt. It gives Wolf's organization legal authority to... He stopped. It's not a real legal document. It doesn't hold up anywhere official. But in Wolf's world, it holds up everywhere that matters. He nodded. Once. A small motion that cost him something. Her phone buzzed again. Then a text came through and she looked at it despite herself. Vincent. Briggs just left Wolf's building. He's heading to your father's house. Right now. You need to leave the restaurant. She read it twice. The restaurant went on around her. Kyle was watching her face. What is it? He said. She stood up. She picked up her jacket. Elena, what? I have to go. Elena. He grabbed her wrist across the table. Not rough, not like Doyle, just the grip of someone trying to stop something from happening that they don't want to happen. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. He let go. Tell me what's happening. She looked at her brother, the man she'd grown up with, the man who had driven across town with a space heater, and also the man who had sat in a room and used the word asset. They're going to Dad's house, she said, right now, because of you. Because you told Wolf something in the last 48 hours that changed his timeline. I didn't... He stopped. His face changed again. I called him yesterday. I told him the other arrangement fell through. I was trying to... You told him I was still available. The word fell between them like something dropped from a height. Kyle Hartwell sat at the dinner table in the restaurant on Mercer Street and looked at his sister and did not say anything. And in his silence, she understood everything she needed to understand about the distance between the brother she remembered and the man sitting in front of her. She turned and walked out of the restaurant. Outside the air was cold and the street was busy, and she called Vincent as she walked, and he picked up before the first ring finished. My father, she said. My people are 3 minutes from his house. We may not be there first. She kept walking, faster now. The city moving around her with its ordinary noise and light, none of it touching what was happening inside her chest. Not panic, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something with sharper edges. What does Wolf do if he gets there first? She said. Vincent was quiet for exactly 1 second. He takes your father, he said, and then he calls you. She stopped walking. In the middle of the sidewalk, people moving around her like water around something fixed. She stopped and stood and understood what this meant. Wolf didn't want Danny Hartwell. He had never wanted Danny Hartwell. What he wanted was the thing that Danny Hartwell's existence gave him leverage over. What he wanted was something to hold over Elena. What he wanted was Elena herself, and her father. Her stupid, weak, endlessly optimistic father who had borrowed money he couldn't repay and signed his daughter's name to solve a problem he'd created. Her father was now the handle by which Carver Wolf intended to pick her up and carry her somewhere she had not chosen to go. She started moving again. "Where is he?" she said. "Where is my father right now?" "Home address. That's where Briggs is headed. I need to get there." "Elena, listen to me. If you go to your father's house right now, I know what happens if I go." She was walking fast, not running, because running in a city at night draws attention, and she had spent enough years being careful that the carefulness was structural now, built into how she moved, even when everything inside her was not careful at all. "I know what happens. I'm going anyway." That is exactly what Wolf wants. I know that too. A pause on the line. She heard him make a decision in the quality of his silence. "I'll meet you there," he said. "Don't go inside before I arrive." She didn't promise that. She hung up and flagged a cab and gave her father's address and sat in the back seat with her hands flat on her thighs and watched the city go past and thought about nothing with great deliberate effort, because thinking right now was not useful, and the habit of not thinking, of staying in the body and the moment and the immediate, was one she had cultivated for exactly this kind of situation. The cab took 11 minutes. She saw the gray Civic parked half a block down before she saw anything else, and she saw the light on in her father's front window, the particular yellow of the living room lamp, the one Danny Hartwell left on every night because he had never fully adjusted to living alone. She paid the driver and got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. Vincent's car arrived 2 minutes later. He came out of it already moving, coat open, and he came to her with an expression that was the closest thing to urgency she had seen on his face. "Briggs went in 4 minutes ago," he said low. "One other man with him. Your father is in there." "I know he's in there. He lives there." "Elena, what do you want me to do?" She looked at him directly. "Stand here." "Yes, until my people get a read on what's happening inside." "Your people?" She looked up the street and then at the building and then back at him. "How many?" "2 on the block, 1 more coming. And Wolf, how many does Wolf have?" "Briggs and 1, probably." She looked at the window, the lamp. She had grown up under that lamp. She had done homework at the table next to it and eaten meals that her mother cooked, and later, after her mother was gone, eaten meals that nobody cooked particularly well because neither Danny Hartwell nor his children had thought to learn before it was necessary. She had sat in that living room through things she didn't want to remember and things she did, and the lamp had been on every time. "I'm going in," she said. "Give me 10. I'm going in." She looked at him with the thing she could feel in her face, the set of it, the thing people saw when she had moved past the point of discussion. "Are you coming?" He looked at her for a moment. He was doing the calculation. She could see it, the variables, the risk assessments, the tactical read of a man who processed every room before he entered it, and she watched him arrive at the decision that some situations did not allow for optimal conditions, and you entered them anyway. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'll stay next to you." He didn't argue. He moved. The building door was not locked. It was never locked. The buzzer had been broken for 2 years, and Danny kept meaning to fix it, and never did. Another thing in his life that had needed fixing, and waited. They went up 1 flight. The hallway smelled of old carpet and someone's cooking from earlier. Unit 4 at the end of the hall, light visible under the door. Vincent put his hand on the door, looked at her. She nodded. He opened it. Her father was sitting in the armchair by the lamp. He was sitting in it the way a man sits when he is trying to appear comfortable and is not comfortable at all. Positioned deliberately, hands on the armrests, the posture of someone who has been told to sit down and has complied. He was 61 years old, and he looked older than that, had always looked older than that since her mother died, the grief having apparently decided to wear him on the outside. His face when he saw Elena did something complicated, relief and horror, and the specific expression of a man who had hoped against the available evidence that a thing would not happen and is now watching it happen. Briggs stood near the window. The other man, younger, with a thick neck and the economy of movement of someone hired for physical rather than intellectual contributions, stood near the kitchen doorway. Briggs looked at Vincent and something moved in his face that was not fear but was adjacent to it. Vincent had that effect on certain people. "Moretti," Briggs said, like a fact, not a greeting. "Briggs." Vincent closed the door behind them. He stood in the center of the room with his coat still open and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at Briggs the way you look at a problem that is smaller than you'd expected. "You should call Wolf." "I will. Call him now. Tell him Moretti is here and that the current approach has changed." Briggs looked at him. Something was working behind his eyes, a calculation, a reading of the room. He took out his phone. Elena was not watching Briggs. She was watching her father. Danny Hartwell had not looked away from her since she walked in. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific kind of reckoning and has been dreading it and is now experiencing the strange near relief of its arrival, the way a long postponed pain is almost a release once it finally comes. "Elena," he said. "Don't." Her voice came out quietly, which she hadn't expected. She had expected anger, and the anger was there, but it was behind something heavier and harder to name. "Just sit there." He sat there. His hands gripped the armrest once and then released. Briggs was on the phone now, his back half turned, speaking in a low voice. The thick-necked man had not moved from the kitchen doorway. He was watching Vincent with the specific attention of someone who understood that the most dangerous person in the room was not necessarily the largest. Elena moved to the chair across from her father and sat down and put her hands on her knees and looked at him. "How long?" she said. He knew what she was asking. She could tell from the way the question landed, like something he had rehearsed receiving. "Elena, how long have you known what Wolf planned to do with me?" He looked at his hands. "I didn't know. Not all of it. Not, how long have you known some of it?" The lamplight was orange and warm and completely wrong for what was happening in this room. Danny Hartwell looked at his hands and then at the ceiling and then at his daughter. 8 months, he said. 8 months. She did the math without wanting to. 8 months ago she'd brought him soup when he had a cold. She had sat in this room and they had watched something on television, and she had believed she was visiting her father because she wanted to, because it was a choice, because family was something you tended because you understood its fragility. 8 months ago he had known, and he had let her sit in this room and eat soup and watch television, and he had said nothing. "You signed a document," she said. His jaw tightened. "They came here with... It wasn't a negotiation. Wolf's people don't negotiate. They present." "Did you sign it?" A pause that lasted several seconds. "Yes," he said. Briggs ended his call. He looked at Vincent. "Wolf wants to talk to you." "I know he does." Vincent did not look away from the room's general configuration. He was tracking the thick-necked man, Elena registered, without appearing to track him. "Tell him I'll call him when I'm ready." Briggs looked uncertain about this, which was probably unusual for Briggs. He looked at the phone and then at Vincent and made the decision that uncertainty in this specific company was worse than delivering bad news to Wolf. He went back to his phone. Elena looked at her father. "You should have told me." "They said if you knew, the arrangement was void. They said..." "I don't care what they said." The quiet in her voice was wearing thin, and what was underneath it was coming through, not screaming. Something colder. "You had 8 months. You had 8 months to tell me, and you didn't." "I was trying to fix it," he said. The word trying, the way he said it, the tired and genuine belief that trying was sufficient. She had heard this her whole life. Her father was a man who tried. He tried to quit gambling. He tried to make payments. He tried to be present after her mother died. He tried to protect her. And what he had produced in the trying was a document with her name on it in a filing system maintained by Carver Wolf. "Fix it how?" she said. He said nothing. "Dad, fix it how?" He looked at his hands again, and she understood from the quality of his silence that there was something else, that the document and the 8 months were not the whole structure. "What did you promise him?" she said. "Besides me, Elena, what else did you promise Wolf?" The thick-necked man near the kitchen shifted his weight. Vincent clocked it. Briggs was still on his phone. The lamp threw its warm, useless light across everything. "Your location," her father said, very quietly. If you disappeared, if someone tried to move you, I said I would tell him where you were." The room was still. Outside a car passed with its radio going, something with a fast beat, and then it was gone. "You would tell him where I was," she said. "I didn't think it would come to... You were going to hand me to them." The cold thing in her voice had found its final shape. "Not one time, not once, ongoing. They needed to know where I was, and you were the one who was going to tell them." Danny Hartwell looked at his daughter, and in his face was every failure of his life compressed into one expression: the love that was real, and the weakness that was also real, and the fact that when those two things had stood against each other, the weakness had won with so little effort that it had probably frightened him, and he had not told anyone it had frightened him because there was no one to tell. "I'm sorry," he said. She stood up. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She had nothing else to carry. "I know you are," she said. "I know." She walked to where Vincent was standing, and she stood next to him, and she did not look back at her father. "Briggs," Vincent said, "tell Wolf I'm calling in 40 minutes. Tell him the Hartwell situation has new parameters. Tell him I want to talk about Pier 11. Briggs stared at him. "Pier 11? He'll know what it means." Briggs looked at the phone in his hand and at Vincent, and then he and the thick-necked man exchanged the glance of two people who have stepped into something larger than the assignment they were given and need to recalibrate. Briggs made another call. Vincent put his hand briefly on Elena's arm. Not guiding, not directing, just a point of contact. And she let it be there for a moment, and then walked toward the door. They were in the car before she spoke. "Pier 11, she said. "Wolf's operational center. The port facility he uses for freight cover." Vincent was driving. He drove the way he did most things, with precise economy. "It's where the trafficking network processes movement. If Wolf is going to negotiate, he'll do it from there. It's the one place he feels untouchable." "And are you going to negotiate?" "No." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to end it." She looked at the city going past the window. They were heading east toward the industrial district, and the streets were getting wider and emptier, and the lights were further apart. She thought about Pier 11, a place she'd never been, that had been operating as the mechanism of her destruction long before she knew it existed. "There's something else," she said, "something you're not telling me, about Pier 11. He was quiet. "Vincent." "The document your father signed," he said. "It has a transfer date." She waited. 48 hours from when he signed it. He looked at the road. "He signed it 6 days ago." She did the math. "Tonight," she said. "Technically tomorrow morning, but Wolf doesn't observe technicalities. He operates on business hours." She sat with that. Tonight. The transfer date was tonight. She had been sitting in a restaurant having dinner with her brother, and her father had signed something 6 days ago, and the date had been tonight, and no one had told her. The entire structure of her situation had had a timestamp on it, and she had been moving through the last 6 days as if time were ordinary. "You knew," she said. His jaw moved. "You knew the transfer date when you met me at the coffee shop," she said. "You knew when you put me in the hotel. I knew there was a document. I learned the specific date 36 hours ago. You didn't tell me. I was managing the information sequence to... Stop." She turned in the seat to look at him. "Stop doing that. Stop managing what I know. I am not a situation to be managed. That is exactly what every single person in my life has done. Managed what I knew and made decisions for me about what I could handle. I am done being handled." He did not say anything for a moment. The car moved through the empty street. Ahead of them, a traffic light cycled from yellow to red, and he stopped at it, even though there was no one else at the intersection, which she registered as a strange, small detail. A man who operated outside most legal structures, observing a traffic light at midnight on an empty street. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes. I was..." He stopped. He seemed to be having a genuine difficulty with the sentence, which was different from his usual precision. "I was trying to give you enough to make decisions, but not so much that..." He stopped again. "That what?" "That you'd make a decision I couldn't protect you through." She looked at him. He was still looking at the red light. That's still you deciding what I can handle, she said. I know. Why does it matter to you, she said. What decision I make? If I walk out of this? If I disappear somewhere, Wolf can't find me. Your operation continues either way. The light turned green. He drove. No, he said. It doesn't. She waited. Wolf has been careful for 11 years, he said. He has never made himself visible enough to be taken apart. The trafficking network moves under 14 different freight covers, and the money goes through 6 layers of legitimate business before it surfaces anywhere traceable. I have been building a case against that network for 14 months, and I have pieces, but I do not have the thread that pulls it all down. I need Wolf to move. I need him to activate the full system. The only thing he will activate the full system for is me. She said it flatly. I'm the thread. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked at the road ahead of them. The industrial district was announcing itself in the distance. Crane lights, the yellow of sodium vapor lamps over the port, the silhouette of infrastructure against a sky that never went fully dark, this close to the city's working core. You came to the diner, she said, because I was the thread. I came to the diner because I needed to understand what Kyle had brought to me. I stayed because... He paused. Because what I saw was not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who knew what they were part of. And what did you see? Someone who had no idea, he said, and who had built a life entirely around surviving not knowing, and who deserved... He stopped. She waited. Who deserved to know, he said. The car stopped outside a building she didn't recognize, a warehouse on the edge of the port district, its loading bay closed, no signage. He got out and she got out and followed him to a side door that opened with a code, and inside there were 3 people, 2 men and a woman, at a table with laptops and radios and the organized clutter of people in the middle of an operation. They looked up when Vincent entered. One of the men, late 30s, close-cropped hair, a scar across his chin that had been there long enough to become unremarkable, he said, Wolf called twice. What did he say? First call was confirmation that Briggs reported in. Second call was this. The man, Reyes, Elena would learn his name later, slid a phone across the table. Vincent picked it up and played the message, and Elena heard Carver Wolf's voice for the first time. She had constructed a version of him in her mind over the past 72 hours. She had imagined something theatrical, a voice that announced its own threat, the voice of someone who understood that he was a villain in other people's stories and had decided to perform it. What she heard instead was a voice like a man discussing a scheduling conflict, calm, organized, faintly irritated. Moretti, I know you're involved now. I know you have the girl. The document is valid regardless. You know how this works. Bring her to Pier 11 by 6 a.m. or the Hartwell men have a problem. Not a complicated problem. A permanent one. A pause. Call me. Vincent set the phone down. Elena stood in the center of the warehouse and felt the message settle into her. Not the threat specifically. She had been living with abstract versions of this threat for days. What settled into her was the phrase, the girl, spoken in the voice of someone describing a shipment. The Hartwell men as a variable in a logistics problem. The calm of it. The administrative precision. This was what she had been inside of. This organized, calm, efficient machine that moved people like freight and spoke about it like it was scheduling. My father and Kyle, she said. Wolf will move on them at 6 if I don't respond. Vincent looked at Reyes. What's the status on Pier 11? Activated, Reyes said. He called in 3 additional crews after Briggs reported. The full freight system is on standby. He glanced at Elena, not unkindly, and looked back at Vincent. He's running it like a transfer, like she's already en route. He wants to use me to get you to move your network, Elena said. She was looking at Vincent. That's what this is. He knows you've been building against him. He's using me to draw you into a position where you have to show your people. Vincent looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not surprise, more like the recognition of someone who has just confirmed a prior assessment. Yes, he said. And you were planning to do exactly that, she said. Go to Pier 11. Draw him out. That's been the plan. With more preparation time, yes. You don't have more preparation time. No. So you're going tonight? Yes. She looked at the table, at the laptops and the radios and the maps she could see partially on the nearest screen. The port, the pier, the grid of industrial access roads. She looked at the woman at the table who had said nothing and who was watching Elena with the particular quality of attention of someone who was good at their job and was doing it right now. She looked at Vincent. "I'm coming," she said. The room went quiet in a specific way. Reyes looked at the table. The thick-necked woman kept her expression neutral. Vincent looked at Elena with an expression that was doing its best to be nothing and was not entirely succeeding. "No," he said. "Wolf's network activates around me," she said. "You said that. I'm the thread. If I'm not there, he doesn't run the full system. He waits. My people can simulate, can they?" She looked at him. "In the last 72 hours, how many times have things gone differently than you planned because of something you didn't anticipate?" He said nothing. "I'm not asking to be in the middle of it," she said. "I'm saying that I am the reason any of this works tonight. I am the one thing Wolf will not be careful about. He's not afraid of me. And that—" She heard the word come out of her with a steadiness she had not expected from herself. "That is the only advantage we have." Reyes looked at Vincent. The woman at the table looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at Elena Hartwell, who was standing in a warehouse at 12:47 in the morning in the clothes she'd worn to dinner with her brother, and who had spent 24 years making herself invisible, and was now, with a stillness that had nothing to do with fear in it, refusing to be invisible at exactly the wrong time. "You understand what Pier 11 is," he said. "I understand it's where he moves people. It's not a conversation. If something goes wrong—" "Things have already gone wrong," she said. "My father signed a document and my brother made a phone call, and Wolf has been running a clock on my life for months, and I have been the last one to know everything. I am done being the last one to know everything." The warehouse held its silence. Vincent looked at her for a long moment with those dark water eyes, and she did not look away, and she did not soften what was in her face. "You stay in the car until I tell you otherwise," he said. "No." "Elena, I'll stay back," she said. "I won't go in first, but I am not sitting in a car while you walk into the place where my name is on a filing system." She held his gaze. "I need to see it. I need to see what was built for me, so that when it's gone, I know it's gone." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned to Reyes. "Get her a radio," he said, "and a vest." Reyes moved. Vincent looked at Elena one more time. "If I tell you to move, you move. If the reason makes sense." He almost said something. Whatever it was, he didn't say it. He turned to the table and began going through the approach to Pier 11, and Elena stood next to him and looked at the map of the place that had been built to process her and felt something she could not name yet moving through her. Not courage exactly, which was a word she'd always found too clean, but something rawer than that. Something that had been there for 24 years under everything else, waiting for the night when there was no more room for pretending. The vest was heavier than she expected. Reyes helped her fit it without comment, adjusting the side straps with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and understood that the person being fitted did not need narration. It sat against her chest like a second rib cage, dense and unyielding, and she breathed against it twice to understand the new constraint. And then she stopped thinking about it. Vincent was at the table with Reyes and the woman. Her name was Carr. Elena had caught that, going through the approach. 2 vehicles. Primary team through the South Access Road, which ran along the port's freight corridor and had 3 points where Wolf's people would have eyes. Secondary through the Waterside Service Road, which required cutting a lock and was a longer route but approached Pier 11 from the blind side of the main structure. "Wolf has 4 confirmed inside," Reyes said. "Possibly 6. The rooftop is the variable." "Rooftop," Elena said. "Wolf uses elevated positions for leverage in negotiations," Vincent said, without looking up. "Snipers is a strong word. Overwatch. Men with rifles who exist to make the other party aware that the conversation has a ceiling. How do you handle that?" You don't engage the roof until you control the floor. He looked up then. Which is why timing matters more than numbers. She nodded. She did not ask any more questions about the tactical specifics because she understood she was at the edge of what she needed to know and what she needed to stay out of. She was not a soldier. She was not going to pretend to be one. What she was, what she had always been, she understood now, without having had the language for it, was a person who survived by reading rooms, by understanding what a space wanted from her and what she could take from it without being seen taking. Pier 11 was a room, a very large, very dangerous room, but she had been reading rooms her whole life. They left the warehouse at 1:40 a.m. The port district at this hour was a different country. The city behind them had the ambient noise of a place that never fully slept. Sirens somewhere, a train, the low cellular hum of a million people dreaming badly. Out here there was machinery and water and the specific silence of infrastructure that operated on its own logic, indifferent to human hours. The cranes were lit, but still. The freight containers were stacked in their precise grids, each one a box of someone's commerce, and the smell was salt water and diesel, and something underneath both that was just the smell of industry, of things being moved, of the organized violence of global trade. Elena sat in the back of Vincent's car. Reyes drove. Vincent was in the passenger seat, and he had said nothing since they left the warehouse, and she had said nothing, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. She looked at the back of his head and thought about what he'd said in the car before, the things he'd stopped saying, and she put it aside. Later. There would be time for the unfinished sentences later, or there would not be time at all, which was a thought she let herself have fully and then set down. They stopped 4 blocks from the pier. "Radio stays on channel 3, Vincent said. He turned and looked at her. His face in the dark of the car was difficult to read, and she had spent enough time with him now to know that this was never accidental. "You follow car. Hello? She stays at the secondary access point until the interior is controlled. You stay with her." "Okay. If the radio goes to static, you leave. You don't wait for me." Elena." He looked at her steadily. "If the radio goes to static, it means something has gone wrong that cannot be corrected by waiting. You leave. That is not negotiable." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "Say it like you mean it." "If the radio goes to static, I leave." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned back to the front and got out of the car. Car appeared from somewhere. She had been in the second vehicle, which Elena hadn't seen arrive, and came to her side. Car was 40 or close to it, with close-cut dark hair and the way of moving that suggested someone who had made a permanent peace with physical danger, not by becoming reckless, but by becoming accurate. She had a weapon at her hip that Elena was not going to look at directly. "This way," Carr said. Not unkindly, just precise. They moved along the waterside service road in single file, staying close to the structure on their left. The pier itself was ahead. Elena could see the lights of it now, sodium yellow and industrial white. A working facility that had been repurposed in its working hours for other work entirely. The main building was a freight processing warehouse, long and low, with a loading dock on the water side and a vehicle entrance on the land side. The structure to the right was an elevated control booth that overlooked the dock, and it was in the window of that booth that Elena could see the shape of a man, backlit, not moving. Rooftop, she thought. Overwatch. Her heart was doing something she was managing to not think about directly. It was beating with a particular urgency that was not quite panic. Panic, she had learned, was only dangerous when you let it make decisions. The heart could do what it needed to do as long as she stayed in front of it. Car stopped them at a section of chain-link fence that had been cut already, Reyes, she assumed, advance work, and held it open without theater. Elena went through first because Carr indicated she should, and she went through in a crouch and straightened on the other side and waited. The radio on her belt said, in Vincent's voice, one word, "Moving." Carr put her hand up. "Wait." Elena waited. Inside the main building, 40 meters away, something she couldn't see was beginning. Vincent Moretti had been inside 6 buildings in his life that he understood could kill him, and he had developed, through experience rather than temperament, A way of entering those buildings that was not about not being afraid, but about making fear computational rather than physical. He processed the room before he entered it, identified the two most likely points of failure, and began from the assumption that one of those points would fail. Planning for certainty was for people who had not been doing this long enough. He went through the vehicle entrance with two men from Reyes's team, and the first thing he saw was the layout confirming what the maps had said. Long floor. 3 partitioned sections for freight staging. At the far end, the dock doors, and in front of the dock doors, under the white industrial lighting that made everything look like an interrogation, Carver Wolf was standing at a table. Wolf was 60. He had the build of a man who had been physically large in his youth and had never entirely lost the memory of it. Not fat, but settled, with a stillness that had become structural over decades of not needing to prove anything physically because the proof was always handled by other people. He wore a jacket over a collared shirt. He looked like a man who had come in from dinner to deal with a logistics problem. There were 4 men visible, 2 near Wolf, 1 at the far partition, 1 near the dock door. The dock door was open 6 inches, enough that the water smell came through, and enough that Elena had been right to clock the control booth. The man up there had a sight line through the gap. Wolf looked at Vincent when he entered, and the expression on his face was that of someone who had expected this and had opinions about the timing. Moretti. He gestured to the table. 2 chairs. Like a meeting. You're early. I didn't see a reason to wait. Where's the girl? Safe. Wolf looked at him. The document is a document, Vincent said. He moved to the table but did not sit. He stood at the near edge of it with his hands at his sides and looked at Wolf with the expression he used when he wanted the other person to understand that the conversation had already been decided, and this was just the announcement. Documents are administrative. They don't change the operational reality. The operational reality, Wolf said, is that Danny Hartwell's debt comes due, and the collateral transfers. That's not a negotiation. That's accounting. The operational reality, Vincent said, is that you have a trafficking network moving through this port under 14 freight covers, money clearing through 6 business fronts, and a paper trail that I have spent 14 months organizing into something that will be very legible to very specific federal offices. He paused. That is the operational reality we're negotiating. The room was very still. The 2 men near Wolf had not moved, but their stillness had changed quality. It had become active rather than ambient, the stillness of people who were waiting for a signal. You're threatening me, Wolf said. I'm presenting terms. With what leverage? With everything I just described. Vincent pulled out a phone and set it on the table between them. The filing is prepared. It transmits on a 60-second delay from a contact who is waiting for my call. If I don't call in, he checked nothing, stated it from memory. 22 minutes. It transmits automatically. Wolf looked at the phone. He looked at Vincent. He looked at the phone again with the expression of a man who is doing rapid arithmetic and not enjoying the results. You've been building this for 14 months, Wolf said slowly. Yes. You're not going to send it. Takes down your own operations along with mine. My operations are structured to survive federal scrutiny. Yours are not. That was always the difference between us. Outside, at the chain-link fence, Elena heard pieces of this through the radio. Carr was monitoring, and her face gave nothing away. And Elena stood in the cold and listened to Vincent's voice do what she had watched him do in the diner and the coffee shop and her father's living room. Occupy a room from the inside out, make the temperature of the space his own, restructure the physics of whatever he entered. And then she heard something the radio didn't catch because it didn't come through the radio. It came from above. A metal door. The control booth's exterior access. Someone was coming down. She looked at Carr. Carr had heard it too. Her hand went to her weapon. She held up her other hand. Stay. And she moved toward the corner of the building with the particular speed of someone for whom speed and silence were not in conflict. Elena stayed. She stayed for 3 seconds. Then she heard the radio go to static. Not gradual. Instantaneous. One moment Vincent's voice, and then nothing, just white noise, the sound of signal interrupted. She had said she would leave. She stood at the chain-link fence in the dark, and the cold and the radio hissed static at her, and she stood there and she did not leave. What she did instead was move toward the building, not through the main entrance, along the water side, where the dock door was open 6 inches, where the gap was large enough that she could see inside if she got close enough. She moved along the wall with her shoulder against the corrugated metal, breathing in the salt and diesel, and she got to the dock door and she looked through the gap. What she saw reorganized everything. There was a 5th man. He had come from somewhere that wasn't the floor. A freight elevator at the far end, she thought, or a mezzanine level she hadn't been told about. He was behind Vincent, not armed with anything visible, which was almost worse because unarmed men who move behind people with that specific intentionality are not there to talk. Wolf was looking at the phone on the table. His expression had shifted from calculation to something more settled, the expression of a man who had just seen his arithmetic improve. "The delay transmits in how many minutes?" Wolf said. 19, Vincent said. He had not turned. He had heard the 5th man. She could tell from the line of his shoulders, not tense but aligned, the way a person aligns when they have located a threat and are holding it in peripheral awareness. "Call it off." "I don't think I will." Wolf picked up the phone from the table. Not Vincent's phone, his own. He made a call, held it to his ear, said, "Do it now," and ended the call. Vincent went very still. "What did you just do?" he said. "Your contact," Wolf said. "The one holding the transmission. His name is Perez. He's been on my payroll for 3 months." He set his phone down. "The filing doesn't transmit. It was never going to transmit. And now I have the content of what you've built, which is considerably more useful to me than Elena Hartwell ever was." The room existed in the space after that sentence for a moment that had no measurable duration. Elena pressed herself against the dock door and felt the cold metal against her back and the weight of the vest against her chest, and she thought with a clarity that was almost physical, Perez, the contact, the dead man's switch that was supposed to be the leverage, gone. Vincent had nothing. She watched through the gap as the 5th man moved closer behind Vincent, and Wolf nodded at the 2 men flanking him, and they came around the table. "I'm going to need that phone," Wolf said. He meant Vincent's. "And then we're going to have a different conversation about your 14 months of work, about where the files actually live." He looked at Vincent with the measured calm of a man who has been patient for a long time and is now being paid for the patience. "And then we're going to call Elena Hartwell and have her come in." Elena pulled back from the door. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this and did not fight it. The shaking was information, not failure, her body processing what her mind was already past. She pressed her back against the wall of the building and looked at the water 30 feet away, black and moving. And she breathed twice, deliberately, the way you breathe when you need your body to catch up to a decision you've already made. Wolf had Perez. Wolf had the transmission. Wolf had Vincent. Everything Vincent had built, 14 months, the case, the leverage, had just been taken from underneath him with 3 words spoken into a phone. The radio hissed. She looked at the dock door, 6 inches. She looked at the chain-link fence where Carr had gone and not come back. She looked at the water. She looked at her hands and stopped them shaking by pressing them flat against her thighs. Wolf was wrong about one thing. He was not going to call Elena Hartwell and have her come in, because Elena Hartwell was already here. She moved back to the dock door. She got her fingers around the edge of it. It moved on its track with a sound that was not quite silent, a low roll of metal on metal, and she stopped it after 8 more inches and looked through the wider gap. Vincent was at the table. He had not sat down, but 2 of Wolf's men were positioned in a way that made standing his only option until they decided otherwise. The 5th man was directly behind him. Wolf was holding Vincent's phone and looking at it with the attention of someone inventorying valuable property. None of them were looking at the dock door. She thought about the coffee tin, the emergency 20, the money her mother had taught her to keep separate from every other thing because emergencies do not announce themselves, and when they come, you need to already have the next move in your hand. She thought about 8 months, 6 days, a document with her name on it signed by a man who loved her in the only way he knew how, which had turned out to not be enough. She thought about the word asset. She thought about Carver Wolf's voice on that voicemail, calm, scheduled, describing the end of her autonomy like a departure time. She pulled the dock door open. It was loud. She had known it would be loud, and she did it anyway because loud was no longer the problem. The problem was the 5 seconds between the door opening and Wolf's men reacting, and what she did with those 5 seconds. Every head in the building turned. Wolf's face when he saw her went through 3 things: surprise, confusion, and then a rapid reassessment that landed on something like satisfaction, because from where he stood, she had just walked into the building he'd spent a year building a system to bring her to. He was still reassessing when she said, loudly, clearly, in a voice that did not shake, "The filing already transmitted." Wolf looked at her. "Perez sent it 90 seconds ago," she said, "before you called him. Perez works for whoever paid him most recently," she said. "Vincent paid him this morning. You paid him 3 months ago. He took both." She stepped into the building and let the dock door roll behind her and stood on the freight floor of Pier 11, with the overhead lights making everything sharp and merciless, and she looked at Carver Wolf. "How long have you been in this business?" Wolf stared at her. "How long?" she said. "And you don't know that people like Perez always take both." She did not know if it was true. She had invented it in the 5 seconds between pulling the door and walking through it, assembled it from what she understood about men like Perez and men like Wolf and the specific arithmetic of people who sold loyalty like a renewable resource. She did not know if Perez had double-crossed Wolf. She did not know if the filing had transmitted or was sitting useless on a server somewhere. What she knew was that Wolf did not know either. And doubt, in a room like this, was a weapon. Wolf looked at Vincent. Vincent's face was doing the thing it did, giving nothing away while processing everything, but she caught something in it, a flicker so brief it was almost not there. Not surprise. Something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like the expression of a man who has just watched someone do something he had not anticipated and is recalibrating with the specific attention of someone to whom recalibration is both professional and personal. "Check it," Wolf said to one of his men. "Call the federal contact. Find out if anything came in." The man pulled out a phone. The room held. Everyone in it held. Wolf and his men in their positions, Vincent with the 5th man behind him, Elena standing at the dock door with her heart doing what her heart was doing, and Wolf in the center of it all, waiting for a phone call that would tell him whether the last 3 minutes had changed everything or nothing. 40 seconds. The man on the phone said something, listened. His face changed. He looked at Wolf, and Wolf looked at Elena. And Elena looked back at Carver Wolf in the place that had been built to process her, and she did not look away, and she did not move, and she stood in the harsh light of Pier 11 and waited for the weight of the next moment to. The man on the phone said, "It's real. Filing came through 40 minutes ago. Federal intake confirmed." The room did not explode. That was the thing about moments like this. You expected the architecture of the situation to respond to the information, to shake or crack or produce some physical evidence of its own collapse. Instead, the room stayed exactly as it was. The lights stayed on. The water outside kept moving. The freight containers in their grids outside remained stacked and indifferent. But Carver Wolf's face changed. Not dramatically, not the way a lesser man's face would change. No fury, no despair, no theatrical collapse. What happened was subtler and in some ways worse. The administrative calm that had defined his expression all night simply receded, like water pulling back from a shore, and what was left underneath was not a different emotion, but the absence of the calculation that had been generating all the emotions. He looked, for approximately 4 seconds, like a man who had stopped running a system and did not yet know what he was without it. Then he looked at Elena. 40 minutes, he said. "Vincent called Perez before we came here," she said. She did not know this. She was saying it with the steadiness of someone who knew it, because steadiness was the only thing she had, and she was not going to give it up. "He ran the contingency the moment Kyle called you 2 days ago." Wolf looked at Vincent. Vincent looked back at Wolf with the expression of a man who has nothing to prove about what he did or did not do. "You burned 14 months, Wolf said. "I spent 14 months, Vincent said. "There's a difference." Wolf was quiet for a moment. He looked at the phone in his hand, Vincent's phone, which now contained nothing that mattered. and he set it on the table with a care that was almost formal, the gesture of someone concluding a transaction. "The Hartwell men," he said, "are not your leverage anymore," Vincent said. "I have 4 people in this room. You have 4 people in this room who now know that everything this operation runs on has been submitted to federal intake," Vincent said. "I'd be curious what their next decision is." Nobody moved for a long moment. Then the man who had made the phone call took 2 steps sideways, away from Wolf, a movement so small it was almost nothing, and so unambiguous it was everything. The second flanking man did not move, but the way he stopped moving changed, a settling, a withdrawal of intention. The 5th man behind Vincent shifted his weight, and Vincent turned and looked at him, and the 5th man made the calculation that all men in his position eventually make, and took a step back. Wolf watched this happen. He watched his room reconfigure itself around him with the specific silence of people who have decided that proximity to a sinking thing is not in their interest, and he absorbed it with the composure of someone who had always known this was a possible outcome and had constructed his life in such a way that he would be able to stand in it when it came. "What are your terms?" he said. Not to Vincent, to Elena. She had not expected that. She stood at the dock door with the freight floor between them and felt the weight of the question land on her. Not the words, but the decision behind them, the recognition that Wolf had looked at this room and identified the correct center of gravity. He had been wrong about many things tonight. He was not wrong about that. She looked at him. 60 years old, built like a man who had never needed to be afraid of other men. Standing in his own facility with his operation in federal intake and his room emptying around him and asking her for terms. She thought about the document, her name in a filing system, the transfer date, the phrase "the girl" spoken into a voicemail like a shipment code. She thought about the people who had moved through this pier who were not her, who had no Vincent Moretti adjacent to their situation, who had arrived at facilities like this one and left in the way that Wolf's freight moved, invisibly, undocumented, into conditions she could not fully imagine because she had never needed to fully imagine them. "Your full network," she said. "Every route, every contact, every freight cover, in writing, cooperating witness status with whoever Vincent's federal contact is." She paused. "And you release my father and brother from every obligation. Every piece of paper with the Hartwell name on it gets destroyed in front of me." Wolf looked at her for a moment. "That's everything." "Yes." In exchange for Vincent not walking out of here and letting what's already in federal intake run without a cooperating witness, she said, "which means you spend the rest of your life as a subject rather than a source. And you know the difference." Wolf looked at Vincent. "She speaks for you," he said. Vincent looked at Elena. Something moved in his face. Not deference exactly, but something that recognized the precise shape of what she'd just done and accorded it the specific weight it deserved. "She speaks for herself," he said. "I'll confirm the terms." Wolf looked back at Elena for a long moment. Then he said, "Get Reyes on the phone. We'll need a structure for the cooperation agreement." "I know," Vincent said. What happened in the next 4 hours was not cinematic. It was paper. It was phone calls made in the freight office of Pier 11 while Wolf sat at the same table he'd used to conduct his business and answered questions from a federal contact Elena never saw. It was Reyes arriving with 2 other people who had the specific demeanor of individuals who spent their professional lives around situations that were technically illegal but operationally necessary and had made their peace with that a long time ago. It was documentation and counter-documentation and the careful assembly of a cooperation structure that would take months to fully process, but whose architecture was established in those pre-dawn hours on the freight floor. Car appeared at 3 a.m., arriving through the vehicle entrance with a cut above her eyebrow and the expression of someone who had handled the man from the control booth and was not going to elaborate. She looked at Elena once, a look that was not approval exactly, but acknowledged that Elena was still here and standing, and then she moved to assist Reyes and said nothing further. Elena stood at the edge of it all and let it happen. She was not needed for this part. This part was Vincent's domain, the architecture of consequence, the building of structures that would outlast the night. She stood near the dock door and looked out at the water and breathed the cold salt air and felt the heaviness of the vest on her chest, and the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained maintenance of a self under pressure. Her phone buzzed at 4:15. Her father. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she answered. Elena. His voice was its nighttime voice, rougher, smaller, stripped of the performed optimism he wore during daylight hours. I know, she said. Are you? I'm fine. A long pause. She heard him breathing. She had known the sound of her father's breathing her whole life, the particular rhythm of it, the way it slowed when he was ashamed, which she recognized now as the sound of this specific silence. The men who were here, he said. They left. I know. Elena, I need to. Not tonight, she said. I can't do it tonight. He was quiet. I'll call you, she said, in a few days, when I can. Okay? The word came out of him small and without armor, the word of a man who understood he was not owed more than that and was accepting it. Okay, sweetheart. She ended the call and stood with the phone in her hand and looked at the water and felt something move through her that she would not call grief exactly, and would not call relief exactly, but which occupied the complicated territory between those two things where most of the real business of living actually took place. The sky over the port began lightening at 5:30. Not dramatically. It was the kind of lightning that happens in industrial districts, gray becoming slightly less gray, the cranes and containers emerging from dark into a pale, colorless morning. Elena watched it happen from the dock. Vincent came and stood next to her at 5:42. They stood for a moment without speaking. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him since the diner, as a presence with specific weight, a disruption in the ambient, something that changed the quality of whatever space it occupied. Perez, she said. He did transmit, Vincent said. I called him this morning, as you said, but he'd already taken Wolf's money months ago. You were right about that. He transmitted for me because I paid him more. A pause. I didn't know if you knew that when you said it. I didn't know, she said. I guessed. He looked at the water. That was a significant guess, he said. I know how men like Perez work, she said. I've spent my life around people who made decisions about me based on who paid them most recently. She paused. I just applied the same logic. He was quiet for a moment. The cooperation agreement will take Wolf's network apart over the next 6 to 8 months, he said. The trafficking routes first, because that's what the federal contact cares most about. The freight covers will be unwound through the Port Authority. It won't be fast and it won't be visible, but it will be complete. The people already in the system, she said, the ones already moved. There are recovery protocols, not perfect ones, but the cooperation agreement includes disclosure of known locations. He paused. Some of them will be found. Some. Not all. She heard the weight of the word and did not push against it because she understood that some was what honesty sounded like, and she had developed over the course of this night an absolute intolerance for anything else. And my father's debt, she said, voided. Wolf signed the release an hour ago. I have the documents. He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope and held it out to her. She took it. She held it without opening it and felt the specific weight of paper that contained the cancellation of a liability that had been quietly shaping her life for years. I want to burn it, she said. The original is in the federal file. That's the binding document. That one is a copy. He looked at the envelope in her hand. So yes, you can burn it. She put it in her coat pocket. Kyle, she said. That one is yours to decide, he said. She had known that was the answer and had asked anyway, needing to confirm that he would not try to make that decision for her. He hadn't. She noted it without softening toward it, because softening toward things too quickly was a habit she was in the process of abandoning. What happens to you, she said. The federal contact, the cooperation agreement, your name is in the middle of all of this. My name is in the middle of very little of it legally. That's been the work of 20 years. He paused. I'll be fine. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She looked back. The lightning sky was doing what lightning skies do, making everything slightly more visible than you expected, revealing the ordinary details that dark had allowed to stay ambiguous. I asked what happens to you, she said, not to your operation. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he was not going to answer, which she had learned to accept as an answer of its own kind. "I'll keep doing what I do," he said. "In different configurations. The work doesn't stop." "Does it ever stop?" He looked at the water. "I don't know," he said. It sounded like the truest thing he'd said since she'd known him, which was not long but felt longer because of the density of what had happened in it. "I haven't been doing this long enough to know if it stops, or if I do." She nodded slowly. "You evaluated me," she said, "when you came to the diner. You said you saw someone who had no idea what she was inside of. That's what made you stay." "Yes. But it was also useful," she said. "My not knowing, my being in that position, it gave you the thread you needed." He did not look away from the water. "Yes," he said, "both things are true." "I know." She looked at her hands resting on the dock railing. "I'm not asking you to choose one. I need you to not tell me it was only one." "It was never only one," he said. "It was both, from the beginning, and then it became weighted differently." He paused. "I don't know exactly when." She looked at the water too. The port was beginning its morning operation around them. The distant sound of machinery starting up, a klaxon somewhere across the basin, a tugboat moving with its low rumble through the channel. "I'm not going back to the diner," she said. "I know." "I have $340 in a coffee tin in my apartment," she said, "and I'm going to figure out what to do with the rest." He didn't say anything. She appreciated that. She had spent her life with people who could not tolerate the silence after a statement that didn't require a response, and who filled it with reassurance or advice, or the particular kind of care that was actually about the other person's discomfort rather than her own. He let the silence be what it was. She pushed off the dock railing and turned toward the building. "I need to go to my apartment," she said, "and sleep for about 12 hours. I'll have someone drive you." "I'll take a cab." He nodded. He reached into his coat, and she thought he was going to produce something. Another card, another phone, another piece of the operational infrastructure that was apparently available from his person at all times. But he didn't. He just straightened his coat, buttoned the middle button. She looked at him standing there at the dock of Pier 11 in the gray of early morning with the water behind him and the warehouse at his back, and she thought, this is the man who came into the Starlight Diner and sat in the corner booth and watched her, and made a decision she wasn't consulted on that had resulted in all of this. The hotel room, the warehouse, the freight floor at 4 a.m, the document in her pocket, the document she was going to burn. She thought about all the things she didn't know about him, and recognized that she was going to continue not knowing them, at least for now, and that this was correct. "Thank you," she said. She said it without the stiffness she'd had when she said it the first time in the diner, because she was not performing manners now, and she was not managing distance. She was just saying what was true. "You did most of it yourself," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you for the parts I didn't." She took a cab back to her apartment as the city was beginning its morning in earnest. The buses running, the early workers on the sidewalks, the storefronts pulling up their gates with the mechanical optimism of places that opened every day regardless of what had happened the night before. She sat in the back of the cab and looked at it all going past and felt the exhaustion settle into her fully for the first time, now that she had stopped needing to manage it. At her apartment, she stood in the shower until the water ran cold, and then she sat on the edge of the bed in a towel, and she opened the envelope and looked at the document inside. It was 3 pages. Official looking in the way of documents that had been created by someone with a formal education in the construction of threat. Her father's signature at the bottom of page 3, his actual handwriting, the specific way he made the H in Hartwell, which she had been seeing on birthday cards and holiday checks for 24 years. She sat with it for a moment. Then she got the lighter from the kitchen drawer, Chalt. She kept it for the candles she burned when the power went out. And she took the document to the kitchen sink and she lit the corner of it and held it while it caught, and she watched it burn page by page in the stainless steel sink, and she did not feel the way she thought she would feel. She thought she would feel something large and conclusive, the dramatic settling of a score. What she felt instead was tired and precise and quietly certain, which was different and turned out to be better. She slept until 4 in the afternoon. When she woke up, she called Kyle. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting. She sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light and she talked to her brother for 22 minutes. She told him what she knew and what she had done and what Wolf had agreed to, and she told him that Danny Hartwell's debt was cleared. She told him all of this in the flat procedural voice of someone delivering information, and then she told him the other thing. "I need you to not call me for a while," she said. "Elena, I'm not ending it," she said. "I'm not saying this is permanent. I'm saying I need time to rebuild the version of you I have in my head into something accurate. And I can't do that while we're talking." He was quiet. She could hear him in his car, the same turn signal she'd heard the morning she called him about their father's birthday. "How long?" he said. "I don't know," he breathed. "Okay," he said. The word had the same weight it had when her father said it, the weight of a man accepting more than he wanted to accept, because the alternative was asking for something he didn't have the right to ask for. "Okay," she said, and she hung up. She called her father on a Sunday 3 weeks later. She had spent those 3 weeks sleeping regular hours and eating with more intention than she usually brought to it, and taking walks in parts of the city she hadn't been to, and thinking about what she was going to do next with the specific focus of someone who had been given, against most of the available odds, the thing she wanted, which was not resolution, because resolution was too clean a word, but the space to decide. Danny Hartwell picked up on the second ring. He sounded the same and different. The performed optimism was gone, or at least muted, and what was underneath it was older and more honest. They talked for 30 minutes. She told him she was not moving back to the Sunday dinners yet. She told him she would call when she called. She told him she loved him in the specific way you love someone who has failed you in ways that were not simple and therefore cannot be responded to simply. Not the love of before, not the same shape, but not nothing either. A love that had been taken apart and put back together with different tolerances. He said he was going to meetings. She said she hoped so. She said goodbye. In the third month after Pier 11, Elena Hartwell signed a 6-month lease on a small commercial space in the east side of Kelmore, 4 blocks from the coffee shop with the fogged windows where she had sat across from Vincent Moretti and agreed to know everything. The space had been a dry cleaning shop for 30 years. The previous owner had left the racks, which she removed. She kept the large front window, which let in the afternoon light with a generosity that seemed to her significant. She had $340 from the coffee tin, plus 4 months of saved diner wages and a small business development loan from a program she found after 3 hours of research. She spent 2 weeks painting the walls herself, the white of somewhere that expected to be filled with things, and building out the counter with materials she sourced from a salvage yard on the north side. She called it Haven, not because of any particular sentiment about the word, because it was accurate, because a place that held people without owning them needed a name that said exactly what it did, and that was the name that said it. She opened on a Tuesday in the 5th month. The first week was slow. The second week was less slow. By the 3rd month, the morning rush was consistent enough that she hired one person part-time, a woman named Doris, who was 63 and had been looking for flexible hours, and who turned out to have an opinion about everything and to be exactly right about most of it. She made the coffee herself because she had been making coffee for other people for 6 years and had developed in those years a relationship with the task that was complex enough to be worth carrying forward. She baked 4 things. She kept the menu small because small meant she knew what she was offering and could stand behind it. She did not think about Pier 11 every day. She thought about it often. She thought about the dock door and the static on the radio and what had moved through her in the 5 seconds before she pulled the door open. She had not told anyone about those 5 seconds except once, briefly, to Doris, who had said, "Well, obviously you went in," with the absolute certainty of someone who found the hesitation more puzzling than the decision. Vincent came in on a Wednesday morning in the 7th month. She saw him through the front window before he entered. Charcoal coat, same way of moving through weather like it was someone else's problem, and something in her chest did the thing it had done in the diner, that low-register shift of attention that she had not yet found a better way to describe. He came in and stood at the counter and looked at the menu board on the wall. "Coffee," he said. "I know." She was already reaching for the cup. She made it and set it in front of him, and he paid for it, and she gave him his change, and he stood at the counter and drank it and looked around the room with the assessing quality he brought to all spaces, and she let him look. "You built something," he said. "Yes." He looked at the front window, the afternoon light that the morning version of Now delivered differently, and he looked at the two people at the corner table who were deep in a conversation that had nothing to do with anyone else. And he looked at Doris in the back moving between tasks with the authority of someone who had decided this place was hers in the way that good employees always eventually decided. "It looks like what you intended," he said. "That's the hardest thing to make," she said. "Something that looks like what you intended." He drank his coffee. She wiped down the counter. The afternoon light did what it did. "The cooperation agreement," he said. "The first trafficking route was unwound last month. 14 people recovered." She stopped wiping. She looked at him. 14, she said. "The second route is being unwound now. It takes time, but it moves." She set the cloth down. She thought about Pier 11, the dock, the 6 inches of gap. She thought about the freight that had moved through that building that was not freight, and the 14 people, and the route still being unwound, and she breathed against it. "How many total?" she said. "We don't know yet," he said. "We may never have a complete number." She nodded slowly. This was what some sounded like in practice. Not a final count, but a direction. A quantity that increased as the work continued and would never fully close because the world did not close fully on anything, only opened into the next thing. "Your father," he said. "Meetings," she said. "Consistently, so far. Kyle checks in on him." She paused. "It's not simple." "No," he said. "It might not become simple." "No," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked back at her over the coffee cup, and she read his face the way she had been reading it for 7 months, which was still imperfectly, still with the understanding that precision was not available here and probably would not become available, and that this was accurate to what it was. "You changed things," he said. "The night at the pier, what you did." "I told a lie," she said. "A guess, at best." "You changed the weight of the room," he said. "With nothing, with your presence in a doorway." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I've been doing my whole life," she said. "Managing what rooms do when I enter them. I just stopped managing it down." He set the cup on the counter. He looked at her for a moment with the dark water eyes that gave things away only when they chose to, and she held the look without flinching and without reaching for it. "I'll come back," he said. "I'm open Tuesday through Sunday," she said. 7 to 3? He buttoned the middle button of his coat. He picked up his change. He always took his change, she had noted this, a small, specific consistency. And he walked to the door and threw it into whatever the afternoon had prepared for him. She watched him go the way she watched most things now, fully, without looking away, without the half-second delay she used to put between herself and anything that might require her to be seen seeing it. She watched him go and felt the room settle back into its own quiet, and she stood at the counter of the place she had built and breathed the smell of it, coffee and sugar and the clean wood of the counter she'd built herself, and she stayed in it. The city moved outside the window. The two people in the corner finished their conversation and gathered their things and left with the particular looseness of people whose conversation had resolved something. Doris came from the back with a tray of something just out of the oven and set it on the shelf and said, "That man, he a friend?" "Yes," Elena said. She thought about the word. Something like that. Doris looked at the door, and then at Elena with the expression of a 63-year-old woman who had arrived at too many conclusions in her life to waste time on uncertainty. She said, which contained several sentences. Elena laughed. It was a short laugh, rough-edged, not the performed kind, the real kind, which she had been producing more of lately, which still surprised her when it came. She went back to work. There were cups to wash and a counter to prep for the closing hour, and the ledger to check because she was still learning the arithmetic of running a thing rather than working inside someone else's thing, and it was harder than she'd expected and more satisfying than she had words for. She worked with the efficiency she'd built over 6 years of the Starlight, and the knowledge that the efficiency was hers now. Not labor she was selling by the hour, but labor she was building into something that would still be here tomorrow. At 3 o'clock, she turned the sign. She stayed inside to finish the closing tasks, and when she was done, she stood at the front window in the empty cafe and looked out at the street. The city doing what it did. The light doing what late daylight does. Going golden and long, making ordinary things look briefly significant before the ordinary reasserted itself. She thought about the diner, the corner booth, the invisible life. She thought about the 20 in the apron pocket and what it had been for, and she thought about the coffee tin and the $340 and what they had become. She thought about the word asset, which she would not forget, which she had decided she would not forget, because forgetting was not the same as healing, and she was not interested in the version of herself that had been smoothed down into something without edges. She had edges. She had learned in the last 7 months that edges were not a failure of character, but a record of it, the specific shape of a person who had been pressed against enough things to know where she ended and everything else began. She turned off the lights and locked the door and stepped out into the evening. The street was doing what streets do. Someone passed her without looking. A bus went by throwing a little spray from the wet gutter. Somewhere up the block a door opened and music came out briefly, and then the door closed and the music was gone. She stood on the sidewalk outside Haven and she looked at the sign she had made herself. Clean letters, plain wood, the name that said what it did, and she felt the specific weight of a thing you have built being real under your hands, the weight of something that exists because you decided it would exist, and then you made it so, and no one had priced it before you did, and no one would. She pulled her coat around her and walked home. The city moved around her and she moved through it, and she did not make herself small, and she did not lower her eyes, and she did not manage herself down to something that would be less likely to be noticed. She walked through it as herself, fully present, fully visible, taking up exactly the space she was entitled to. And the city accommodated her the way cities accommodate people who have decided to take up their space, which is to say without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any particular fuss. Which was exactly what she had always wanted, not to be rescued, not to be protected, not to be managed or priced or transferred or held as leverage against someone else's debt. Just to move through the world as herself, unowned, and have the world make room. It did. She kept walking.